Hi everyone, I hope you all had fun at the student showcase and workshop events, as well as enjoyed a yummy meal on us. Now we will dive into an event that is extremely pertinent to this year's theme of AI for Good, which is our Ethics in AI panel. Ron Bodkin will be joining us again for the panel, along with Rishi Behari and Valerie Morignat. Valerie is the CEO of Intelligent Story, former professor from Montpellier University in France, author, and an expert in AI ethics. Rishi Behari is a former associate director at the Smith MMAI program and an advisory board member for Incubate. This panel will be moderated by Catherine Wu, our very own logistics manager. While Catherine has some of her own questions and discussion topics that she'll be bringing up with the panelists, we strongly encourage guests to ask questions at this event. Now, without further ado, our Ethics in AI panel.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us at our Ethics in AI panel. As Max just said, I'm Catherine, the Logs Manager for CUCAI 2021. I'm really excited to be here and joined shortly by some of our incredible panelists to discuss and hear their insights on our very societally relevant and important topic of, the different ethical concerns and challenges that exist as both society and the AI industry continue to develop and progress. So just to quickly go over how this event is going to run before bringing our panelists on. First, we'll have a bit of an introduction, get to hear their journey in the AI field and how it's led them to this point. Next, we will go through some topics and questions on ethics and its role in the AI landscape. And finally, we're going to open up the floor to you guys and your questions for our panel. So without further ado, I am super pleased to introduce our panel, starting with Ron Bodkin, the VP of AI Engineering and CIO at the Vector Institute. We have Dr. Valerie Morignat, the founder and CEO of Intelligent Story LLC, and Rishi Behari, the lead instructor for the Smith School of Business's Master of Management AI Workshop Series. So to kick things off, why don't you guys all give a bit of an introduction to yourself, what you do, and maybe a brief explanation of your journey in the AI field so far. So Ron, why don't you start us off?
All right. Well, it's nice to be back this afternoon. Most of my career, I've been a serial entrepreneur, a techno-optimist, thinking about how better technology can make life better for all of us. Also had a long-term interest in AI, even back to my studies at McGill and MIT. More recently, I've been very focused on AI and how it's affecting society, both the long-term implications and near-term. So how it's already starting to create challenges for us. I continue to believe that it's incredibly powerful, good technology for good, but incredibly important for us to be responsible. In my role as engineering lead, both at the Vector Institute and the Schwartz-Reisman Institute, I really focus on beneficial applications of AI and how do we ensure responsibility. So I'm excited for the panel today.
Yeah. Dr. Valerie, would you want to give us a brief introduction?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm really thrilled to share this panel with brilliant minds. So I'm Valerie Morignat. I am currently the CEO of Intelligent Story, which is a strategy firm specializing in AI strategy, AI ethics, and AI education. And as a matter of fact, I also serve as a professor of AI strategy and responsible design at AI Event City in Paris. I teach remotely. And my interest in AI started actually within the cinema industry. I was a cinema professor of cinema and interactive arts for about a decade in France. And I taught a variety of topics, including the aesthetics of movies. And of course, science fiction movies were the movies I would analyze the most. So I analyzed the representation of robots, virtual reality, AI in movies, but also the technical side of AI in cinema, such as, for instance, using AI to simulate crowds or to animate CGI characters. So I've done a lot of things in that realm for many years. And then in the US, I also worked in the healthcare sector and the design of VR and AR experiences for patients and for healthcare professionals. And that also integrated AI. And since then, I started my own company, and I'm now really focusing on AI strategy and, very importantly, on ethics as a pillar of strategy.
Amazing. And Rishi?
Yeah, pleasure to be here again at CUCAI and to be a part of this panel. And so as mentioned, my roles right now, I currently teach professional communications in our Masters of Management in Artificial Intelligence program for the last year and a half. I was the associate director running a relatively new program, and it's going into its second and third year of the of its existence. So management in artificial intelligence, really the intersection of technology and business, and preparing our students for that. My background itself, actually, my undergrad's in psychology and sociology, and so studying, the human brain, human interactions, and there's a lot of connections between, things we talk about in AI, which I do find fascinating. I ended up doing my master's in business at Smith, at Queen's University, at the Smith School of Business, and spent some time in Madrid, in Spain, at IE, Instituto Impreso, there, and specialized in innovation and really looking at design thinking, human-centered innovation and design. And I think it's that path that really led me into AI. When you look at the intersection of business, innovation, human-centered design, and the intersection between technology and people, that has always fascinated me. I also do have some roles specializing around areas of equity, diversity, indigenization, inclusion, and I'm sure we'll talk about bias as part of ethics. And so obviously AI is very relevant in that area as well. So those are some of the things I've done and how I ended up here today.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. Thank you again for being here with us. We're super excited to get right into it. So yeah, let's just get into it. As for the audience, please drop any questions you do have for our panelists in the hop-in chat as we go along, and we'll get to those as soon as we can. So like you mentioned, Rishi, we're just going to start off with kind of right into the meat of it. So what are some common steps or steps that you think organizations should be taking to either revise their algorithms or data sets to be checking for underlying biases? How necessary are these steps, and how do you think they impact the effectiveness of potential algorithms? So Rishi, why don't you take this one away?
Sure. I like to focus, as I mentioned, based on my background, on the human side of this. And so when I talk about diversity and inclusion, a lot of what we talk about is unconscious bias. So that's bias that people aren't even aware of. And ultimately behind AI are the developers, are the people writing these algorithms, collecting the data sets. And so I think, what I would say is it's important to have a diversity of people, diversity of backgrounds, and to be checking some of the assumptions you might bring in. I'm sure people are familiar with multiple examples, but an easy, famous one is what happened at Amazon when they tried to use AI to filter resumes, and they ended up not having any female applicants. And so that revealed the bias that was built in by the largely male staff that were there building an algorithm. So I think on the technical side, there's certainly things you can do. I am a fan of going back to the human side and looking what we can do with the human piece to eliminate bias at that level, because really that's where it gets introduced. And there's a quote I like, which is, it's an old Greek kind of quote, but man is the measure of all things is the shortened version of it, or humans are the measure of all things, so that we're always going to have bias. And I think part of it is acknowledging that what we do will always have a degree of subjectivity, and it's always going to be, the onus will always be on us to try and go in and correct that, because it can have very serious impacts on people's lives in some of the applications of AI. So that's sort of, what I think is really important for organizations to look at.
Yeah, for sure. Dr. Valerie, did you want to take?
Yeah, I actually love what you just said, because you're really focusing on what I think is really the ground of the problem here, the mindset, right? If we want to build better models, we need to build better behaviors. So everything really roots in the mindset and in building awareness in people that they are also interpreting the world through their own filters and their own biases. And there's a lot of work to do there. And of course, there's also the applied ethics approach, which consists in not just addressing the behaviors and the mindset, but also addressing technically methods that can actually detect and mitigate bias in algorithms. And I would say that what I find the most important approach is an approach that starts with addressing who is in the team. What does the team look like? If we have a multidisciplinary team, and if we have a very diverse team in terms of demographics, but not just demographics, also diverse cognitive approach, diverse backgrounds, we will have more interesting questions that we will be asked, and we will have also more perspectives that will be raised. And I think that that's the best way to actually build algorithms and make sure that the thinking in the team is really encompassing the multidimensionality of humans. So my recommendations to companies most of the time are to first build a multidisciplinary and diverse team, then conduct an impact assessment in the very beginning of your project to make sure that the problem is actually well designed and formulated, and make sure also that some adverse impacts are not going to make people, the end users, more vulnerable than they already are. And then, of course, audit the fairness of the data. Is the data properly sourced? Is it matching the end goal? And design the system for fairness. So, like I said, is the problem properly formulated? Is the model also ensuring that we do not include unnecessary features that could themselves induce bias? And at the end of the day, it's really about always testing the models for bias and making sure that we never cease to do so, and make sure that we also document that, because of course models will keep evolving, and we need to stay very vigilant on this regard.
For sure, yeah, those are definitely some great points. Rhonda, do you maybe want to speak to some of the technical, more technical aspects of things that maybe come up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think agreed. Those are both great perspectives, and I think the important to note that you have to start with what are your values or your objectives? What are you trying to do? And I totally resonate with the language of mitigating bias, right? Sometimes technical people come with the language of de-bias. And of course, there's no such thing as fixing bias, right? I mean, bias is inherent in human processes. But we have to decide, like, what are we trying to achieve, and what's a balance of benefits and harms? I think that's a really important perspective. What are the metrics you're going to use? I think you have to look at the whole supply chain. So the input data is really important. But in fact, when you look at Rishi's example, why was there bias in the Amazon hiring algorithm? Well, it turns out that they had historical bias in their hiring. And so training a model based on historical bias produced biased outcomes. In other cases, you also can look at more complicated scenarios like, what are the system effects, right? So it's not enough to say, hey, at this point in time, if we made this intervention, how would it change? But for example, supposing we lower the criteria for credit for a underserved community, what's going to happen if they have higher default rates, and how will the system dynamic play out, right? So it's not as simple as taking a simple snapshot. And yes, there's some great progress on different definitions that are in conflict in most cases around what is group fairness that can be done for classifiers. But even taking that, it's not as simple as saying, well, we're just going to adjust our thresholds and therefore we'll remove bias in the system. You have to think about more. There's other kinds of bias, like embedded bias stereotypes in language models, right? You discover that language models, there's been good work taking tests on human stereotyping, and language models exhibit a lot of those. And there's a good paper by Suresh and Gutag, A Framework for Understanding Unintended Consequences of Machine Learning, that really does a nice job of laying out all the whole pipeline from input to deployment, and what are the ways that bias can come in. And there's mitigation techniques for all of them, right? So sometimes it's about sourcing data or correcting data. Sometimes it's about sampling techniques or adjusting thresholds. There's been some great work at Vector on representation learning to try to train features that you can put into your model in a way that you can adversarially show that you can't reconstruct a protected feature. Because it's important to understand that just by, sometimes people take the attitude of like, we just don't want to feed something sensitive in, like a gender, into the model. But it's very easy for models to learn proxies for protected attributes and therefore discriminate even if you didn't explicitly feed it in. So in fact, sometimes the well-intentioned approach of saying, hey, we want to not feed in a protected variable prevents you from actually monitoring bias, right? So we see some of our sponsors at Vector struggle with this, that they're not allowed to collect certain demographic information, but then they have no way of measuring what the effect of their models are, right? They can't say if there's unintended bias because they don't have the tool to do it, right? So so there's lots of work, there's active research, but the good news is there's not only good research that's been published, there's also great open source tools that ranging from Equitas to IBM and Microsoft and Google have all put out open source tools in this space. So there's a lot of good options. And the last thing I'll say is, even though we talk a lot about bias and risks of bias, the opportunity of doing better than the biased processes in human-driven systems is really, in a sense, what's exciting to me, right? That we have to remember that human systems are filled with these unconscious biases too.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for your incredible perspectives on that, both on the human side and the technical side. Definitely important things to consider as we continue developing models and different things. So we're going to go into another kind of similar question on how AI models are really affecting the climate. And so it has been published that training one AI model could produce the same carbon emission as 5 cars in their lifetime. So how do we justify, this environmental effect of developing and training these models? And what kind of future or developments do you see for model training as, society is striving towards diminishing carbon footprints? So maybe Valerie, if you wanted to take this one away.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually love that question. I just want to say, I would like to say one thing here. I mean, we know today that the first source of carbon emission is actually the meat and dairy industry, right? So if we want to make an impact, we need to think about that. But now let's talk about the pollution footprint of algorithms. It's a twofold issue, because on one hand, AI can really reduce the effect of climate change. We know that there are some really interesting research today done in fueling with AI, smart grid design, lowering infrastructures, emissions, and also climate modeling. All in those realms, AI is really interesting. It's really interesting tools. There are some really interesting startups also. Some are using, for instance, machine learning to detect the areas that are best for planting seeds and helping the forest where it was really damaged actually by other types of industries. AI is used to protect the coral reef. AI is used to better predict disasters in areas that could be really dramatically impacted, and people could suffer a lot. So AI can be used in a very purposeful way, and I really believe that what we should focus on is purposeful AI. Now, that is not to say that AI in itself is not potentially a source of pollution, and we need to address that too. And most of the time, the key metrics to actually evaluate a deep learning model is not including the total energy and carbon footprint of the model. And I think that it should. I think that we should also, when we design algorithms, when we design those models, we should make sure that we make choices that make them as efficient as possible in terms of minimizing the computing power required for model training, for instance. And that can happen by choosing more energy efficient hardware. That can happen by calibrating its setting with energy use in mind. So I think that it's really a question of transparency here. If we make sure that we systematically integrate total energy and carbon footprint in deep learning model metrics, we will also really motivate engineers to make better choices and more energy efficient choices. But I really think that making the shift toward purposeful AI and encouraging every initiative that can actually be at the service of the planet is a really important way to recreate some balance between the carbon footprint caused by the algorithms, and on another hand, the benefits of using AI for the planet.
Yeah, definitely great to hear the twofold of how AI is impacting the environment. Rishi, did you want to add anything from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. I think it's just important to kind of put it in context because as Valerie mentioned, the meat and dairy industry, we talk about when people talk about AI, they're kind of like they look at it in isolation. But there's a trade-off that we've made in every industry with consumer goods. You can look at the way televisions have changed. You could look at the way cars have changed. Things have gone from high energy intensive creation into something that becomes more scalable and cheap over time. And AI is no different than that, really. And it's important to note that I do know of some of the things that are happening on the technical side, like advances like tiny machine learning, I think they call it. I know there's researchers dating back 10 years into I believe they're called risters. Maybe Ron will know a little bit more about those, but they just allow it to happen, machine learning to happen more efficiently. And so I know there's active research in those areas. And just remember that we're making a trade-off. However, as Valerie mentioned, the trade-off in this case is actually that we can start to solve problems. So this intensive energy use that over time, I believe most experts believe we're going to get more and more efficient at it, is also at the same time allowing us to solve global problems. And so to keep that in mind and in context. And it's funny, even with the examples that we use, we say, a machine learning model or a language processing model can take as much energy as a plane, so many plane trips and so many cars. These are things we do every day, knowing that trade-off. And so we're saying, this is as bad as things that we already do en masse. And so I think it's just important to put that back into context, and it's important to make sure that we're evolving the science, but to also remember that these are some of the trade-offs we're making, knowing that hopefully this is going to help us tackle problems in the long run.
Yeah, definitely. Good perspective. Ron, did you want to speak on maybe some of the research or developments that Rishi alluded to, or any that you know of yourself?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few points here. One is certainly we in our compute cluster are tracking the carbon footprint, and I think it's worth noting that the really high emission models are outliers, right? That there's a small amount of research that's incredibly resource intensive, like some of the large language models and neural architecture search models, but that most of the models, the kind of models that our researchers are training, are far smaller footprint. But you have to measure things, right? So the metric is an important thing. I think one of the good things is that when you look at what are the kinds of emitters of greenhouse gases that computer systems that use electricity are very amenable to green energy, right? So it's very feasible to make these systems run off green energy. If you really have the right incentive structure in place, there's a lot you can do, which could even include, for example, rather than training models and keeping them running at peak electricity demand, there's very little carbon footprint for training off a base load, right? So there's lots of ways that you could trade off taking a little longer to do large scale research and not have a carbon impact, as well as, of course, as we develop better storage technologies, it could have a big impact. Personally, I think that we should have a more holistic approach, with carbon taxes, greenhouse gas taxes. So there's the right economic incentive for all actors. Because I think as long as there's strong incentive to improve model performance, that there's going to be tension around conservation. And I guess the last thing I'd say is we also have to think about not just the machine learning that's going on in the data center in the cloud, but also the machine learning that's going on in the edge. Increasingly, our phones and IoT devices are spending a lot of energy on machine learning models as well. And that's also a part of the footprint. And in fact, it may be more challenging to have green solutions to some of those. So we have to be holistic in our thinking, not just focus on the data center.
Absolutely, and if I can actually add something to what you just said, I think that again, it's a question of mindset. Where do we set our priorities? What is the most important thing? And today we know that the planet is the most important thing because we have only one planet, right? So if we have an amazing tool such as AI that is going to evolve and that is going to help us solve more and more problems, then we should absolutely focus, as I mentioned earlier, on the use of AI for a purpose that can actually help us live better, and not just us, but other species, and help the ecosystem thrive. And currently we're facing a lot of problems. And I do think that the more we will raise awareness on the carbon footprint of technologies, the more we also give the opportunity to those who make them to do a better job, and to be more conscious of the fact that maybe they should also make the shift towards cleaner energies. And it doesn't mean that this will slow research or prevent innovation from happening. Like you just mentioned, only very large models are making headlines in terms of pollution today, and it's not any small random model that will have that kind of adverse consequence. And inherently, any technology can bring an adverse effect. And the most important aspect of this is that it raises awareness on the fact that we need to put in place the right protocols, the right guardrails, and importantly, we need to innovate with the right mindset.
Also, just a quick note on something Ron touched on. I think is interesting, as I've been reading about the idea that the internet will reach some type of capacity over time for compute power, so that we'll have to shift to devices like phones, so that a lot more of the processing will be able to happen in your phone versus the internet. I've read some theories around that. I think that's an interesting idea to look at. If we're going to have just a lot more processing power in our hand, walking around every day, and less in the cloud.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks for those incredible perspectives and giving all of us a couple more things to think about, and a couple different ways to think about things. I think we're going to move into audience questions now, because we'd love to get your questions to these panelists. So if we can put up the first audience question, we have a question for Ron specifically, and it's: should computer scientists and machine learning developers need to sign a code of ethics similar to doctors and engineers?
Well, it's a great question. I think it would be very good if we had a kind of ethical code. I would start with, it would be great if more technical people working in the field had simply training on ethics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing more of that being integrated into the curriculum, right? So there's a healthy response to have some ethical training. I think one thing I'll say, I think that's important, but it's also, I think it still raises a lot of challenges when people are faced with working on something that has some ethical challenges. How are they going to respond, right? So it's really the point. I think a lot of times, fortunately, there's a lot more awareness now, and we've seen cases where people working in companies have protested, whether it be Amazon engineers protesting over the climate policies of Amazon, or Google engineers protesting over the use working on weapons systems, right? So you suddenly see or perceived weapon systems, right? Or and so it goes, right? Facebook, similar, right? So I think it's an important step. I think many things can contribute, and this is one that I think would be valuable. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's usually a foundation. And you said something very important. Not everybody is trained or has received any kind of training, not just in AI ethics principles, which are now accessible to anyone who will Google AI ethics, right? But to what does it mean to build ethics in your thinking? What does it mean to build ethics in your design? And computer sciences today as a field really need to integrate ethics, and particularly techno-ethics, which is actually not a new field at all. It has been here for some time now, but AI ethics is a different approach, and it needs to be part of computer sciences. And because it raises concerns not just about bias in algorithms, for instance, but also the potential for misuse, the potential for weaponization of AI. Who will be impacted by that? How do we mitigate that? Do we need to build culturally responsive algorithms, for instance? So there's a whole set of questions that really brings the humanities within the computer science field. And I think that we will see that more and more, that hybridization between, I would say, yes, the computer science field and philosophy, socioeconomics, sociology, and there's a lot of correlations here between those fields that really are at the core of what AI will become.
I think that maybe quickly, just one of the interesting practical challenges that comes up here is geopolitics. And we know that a lot of innovation does come from military historically, and no country really wants to give up the advantage they might have in leveraging this type of technology by, adhering to a certain set of rules. And so, not to say that it definitely shouldn't be done, but I think that's going to be one of the ongoing challenges, like what Ron talked about, the use of drones to identify people. That could be, I know Google stepped away from that because of thoughts on it being potentially weaponized. But there's other applications, and if the military is using it, I think countries, it's going to be an important conversation about what we agree to as an international community, because in some cases you could think of this as not too different to what's happened in the past of human history with nuclear technology and things like that, where if we don't come to some type of agreement, then it could go unchecked in many cases. And we're in a bit of a Wild West scenario right now.
And it's all the more important that, contrary to the nuclear power, it's not going to be in the hands of everyone, right? Nuclear is not in the hands of everyone, but AI will be in the hands of everybody. It's going to become more and more powerful, cheaper, and more accessible. So it means that the potentiality also for threat actors, even small threat actors, is potentiality for them to use that enormous power that AI has is all the more important. So that needs to be addressed. And you just mentioned something actually that makes me think of another aspect that is in that question. That question is about should computer scientists sign a code of ethics? Today we have principles and we have values, but we do not have one universal code of ethics that reflects also already the diverse geographical and cultural viewpoints, right? So some aspects of privacy do not mean the same thing in China that they mean in the Western world, for the Western world, for instance, for cultural reasons, for political reasons. So it's a very complex problem, and ethics is not just a set of principles. It's really a way of thinking and a way of designing and a way of innovating and collaborating that is a little bit different than just checking boxes.
I think that's really important. I would just offer that, I think a lot of times technical people gravitate towards the safe place of what are things that we can form consensus on, but there are real meaningful conflicts of values, right? There's a big conflict of value between liberal societies and authoritarian societies. And, I don't think we should subscribe to a least common denominator of what we can agree on with authoritarian regimes around what our values should be.
Exactly.
Great point.
Yeah, awesome. I think we will go on to another question from the audience. So this one is specific for Rishi, but of course you guys can all discuss. In a world where companies can predict customer demands with their collected data, how could policymakers draw a boundary between business and citizen privacy?
Really good question, super relevant for today's world. And I think one of the interesting ideas that's come up recently has been the idea of a data broker that individuals could have. So versus trying to have policy widely, one idea could be that there could be someone that manages your data for you, because one of the issues, again, going back to human behavior, is that we don't read terms of service or agreements that we sign. We scroll, and hit yes a lot of the time. I know, like, WhatsApp just recently changed their terms of service. Some people may have left, but it's hard for people to really understand what those things mean. So the idea could be a third-party broker, for example, might be someone where you give them the parameters. This is what I do want to share. This is what I don't want to share. And they would help make those decisions for you. And they would consult with you and to say, are you comfortable with this level? Because with so much going on, people, I would say, probably are not managing it on their own adequately to protect themselves. And so you get into a situation where what's in the public interest, and I'm not sure if it would be policy wide as much as the onus might fall on individuals or potential third parties to help do this. And so I think it's interesting to see if that will happen. And yeah, I always come back to human behavior. it's how we interact with these things. It's not that the information isn't given to us. It's just that we're not necessarily aware of it, and we want the convenience of these things. And so when you talk about like predicting, can predict customer demands. I talked about Amazon earlier, but Amazon doubled its revenue from a $35 billion a year company to a $70 billion company just by predicting what I'm going to buy next and saying, hey, Rishi, you bought this. Would you like to buy that? And there's also a benefit to that for me too. It's like, oh, I did want that thing. So we tend to think of marketing and ads in a negative light, and there's definitely an important conversation to be had around that. But there's also the idea that I don't spend and waste time looking for things or getting things that I don't need, and the things that are promoted to me are things that I want. So again, it seems like consumers are saying that's a trade-off I'm willing to make on the whole right now. And obviously awareness is changing. A lot of people probably watch The Social Dilemma, things like that on Netflix. They're starting to understand these things more, but I don't personally see that the understanding of the trade-offs we're making is at the level where I would consider the average person to be highly informed on what they're trading for convenience.
I think you said something really important, because it really depends on how the data is used, right? What is the business objective? And indeed, if the business objective is actually to deliver a product that I would have bought anyway, that I knew I wanted, and as a result, because they knew that I was going to purchase it, they're able to deliver it sooner than later, because it's already been shipped to a warehouse close from where I live, then it's to my benefit, and I see no problem with that. But if the data is used to actually increase the cost of my healthcare insurance or the cost of my car insurance, then this is a problem, because of course this is where some populations can be very unfairly treated. And that's where people should have more transparency regarding how the data is used to most likely enable large companies to profit of them. And I think that this is really an issue that needs to be approached in a very granular way, and the balance is always in who is benefiting from artificial prediction. Is this only the company who's able to deliver that service and to use that power, or is this benefiting also the end user by making the customer experience a lot more intuitive, the purchasing process a lot more flawless? So I think it's an issue that has many facets, and there's not one solution or one ethical recommendation that will fit the multidimensional aspects of that issue.
Those are great points. I would build on that to say, in addition to the relation of the individual to the business, there's a common interest in privacy. Privacy is an expectation that we have as a society. And so when it's degraded, it actually affects third parties, right? So if we find that we're increasingly having privacy eroded, and even more, if we're increasingly finding that we're in the uncomfortable choice of opting out of popular communication mechanisms and being isolated or surrendering our privacy, that's not a choice at all, right? So privacy, that's an important way that governments and yes, collectives, data trusts and so on can rectify the balance. The other factor that I worry about is also the sense of manipulation, right? That as we get, more and more information is collected about people, there's more and more ability to optimize in a way that might appeal in the short term, right? Like every time I'm watching that next video, it feels like a good choice. And then it's 2:30 a.m. and I get a bad night of sleep. And the next morning, I'm really sorry I did it, right? Well, we don't want that, right? And how do we rectify and give people a little more agency and control, right? Or similarly, if I keep being upsold on an attractive item that is tempting me to overspend my budget every month, that's a problem too. But again, in the moment, the products that are appealing to me, I like. So we have to think about these factors.
I wanted to add one more thing to it, actually. This is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, Valerie, you were talking about movies. And so in Harry Potter, forgive me going down this nerd rabbit hole for a second, but they teach defense against the dark arts. And I think sometimes we need to teach defense against manipulation and persuasion at some point in our curricula. And so you have an idea of how you're being influenced. So I mentioned that I teach professional communications. So one thing, I've been working with a neuroscientist on how do people make decisions. Communication is very important in explainability and interpretability of AI, but how do people actually make decisions? And he suggested it's the it's the corporations that have all this data that are able to nudge us in imperceptible ways. Some people might be familiar with Cambridge Analytica, the US election, issues like that. But the idea basically that we can be manipulated and influenced without being aware of it. So I think one thing we can do is also in our education systems from a very early age, because people are using social media, younger and younger, is to teach defense almost against these things. How are you potentially being nudged or manipulated, and what can you do about it? And so I think that's an interesting aspect of education that could come up in the near future as well.
Yeah, and that has never been more important than now, because those issues have always existed, right? Propaganda has always existed. Disinformation has always been used as a weapon to manipulate people, and unfortunately, people read less now than they used to, and we know that what can be at stake here is our ability as human beings to actually use our critical thinking, use our creativity, and I think that the problem we are facing right now is that AI is really amplifying those issues. And we've seen that problem with YouTube, and how YouTube corrected their algorithm to reintroduce a little bit more cognitive diversity in people's environment, and take them out of that bubble within which they were very quickly entrapped, because they started watching a video, and then the next video was just reinforcing the idea that existed in the first one, and so forth, until their entire media environment was just an echo chamber reinforcing that idea that they thought was interesting in the first video, and maybe was not that interesting, or should have been contradicted by a video saying something on the opposite spectrum. So I think it's really important to address that, because although those manipulation techniques have always existed, now they are being amplified, and importantly, they are being automated based on who we are. And that's a very, very important shift.
Yeah, some great points and great answers. We are actually going to run our panel till 2:40, just to give us 10 extra minutes. So we're going to take up another audience question. So this one is for Dr. Morignat. And so it says, can you speak to how pop culture has helped to perpetuate and create a fear of AI, making social integration more challenging? So
yes, I love that question. That's my favorite question. That's an important question, because actually you have, if you look at the Western world, the origin of the idea of the artificial creature does not exist only in movies. It exists also in the literature that was produced in Europe for many years. It exists in mythology. You can go back as far as 2,000 years ago, and you will find the ancestors of artificial intelligence and robots. And you will find also archetypes that will, of course, exist in movies, and the story is always the same. It's always a story of transgression, right? It's always a story of someone who created a creature, and that creature is going to turn against the creator. It's going to turn against human beings. It's going to either end humanity or end the world. So there's the idea of being punished by that technology, by that intelligent creature that should never have been born, because it's a competition against God, right? And that is a projection of the Western world that is really everywhere in movies, but that's an old fantasy. It's not just science fiction movies which created that. And if you look at the Southeast Asia, for instance, things are completely different over there. We do not see that pattern of mistrust and fear of machines. That's because the heritage is very different. It's not that Judeo-Christian heritage that really influences the way we see machines. Over there, we have the influences of Buddhism, Taoism, for instance, also. And in those philosophies, machines are not perceived, or artificial creatures are not perceived as the competitors to human beings, because human beings are also emerging from different cosmogonies and different mythologies. And so, yes, the representations that those movies and that past literature carries are very important because they influence the way we adopt technology. It influences the way we represent ourselves in that environment where technology is everywhere. And it's true that in the Western world, those narratives are really preventing a smooth adoption and a fearless adoption of intelligent technology. People have the fear of being replaced and potentially destroyed by them, where in regions like China or Japan, for instance, because the cultural heritage is completely different, the symbolism is different, and as a result, the representations are different. And you see even examples today of monks, which are artificial monks actually blessing people, or artificial monks that are delivering prayers automatically during funerals. This is something you would never imagine anywhere in Europe or in America.
I think those are great points. I think that in my mind, one of the bigger challenges is, these old stories, this mythology is very divorced from the real concerns. What are the real problems, right? And so people focusing on the wrong things miss out, right? Like we miss out how, if we don't know how to govern these current early uses of AI and how they're affecting society, it's not going to get easier, right? So we have to have a rational view, like what is it actually and what is it not, right? So like the Terminator is not the threat that I sit around worrying about, right? But there's in my mind a smooth continuum from today's systems to incredibly capable systems where, how do we respond if we're completely dependent on AI for how our society governs, and we discover the increasing loss of agency and increasing threats, right? Like we couldn't live without electricity in our modern world. Does anyone think we're going to get where in 50 years we can operate the world without AI? So what do we do as we discover it has fundamental challenges in the way it's being built and deployed? We should be thinking about those problems and not the Terminator.
I agree with you.
Go ahead, Valerie.
I was just going to react to what you just said, because you used the word continuum, and I think that what those movies and those narratives are doing is that they are almost dissociating us from those technologies that we are creating, and that's really a false representation, because historically those are very, very, their roots far back in the past. Artificial intelligence as a computer science discipline is 70-year-old, but the idea of artificial intelligence, I can find a trace of that 2,000 years ago. Or very, very few people know, for instance, that the first self-driving car was actually designed and built by Leonardo da Vinci. And he created that blueprint. He built an entire little cart that would actually deliver vegetables in the city of Florence in Italy. And so when we look at that, we can see that those questions are ancient. The desire to project ourselves within machines and the desire to create autonomous machines that can do things for us, those ideas are old. What is very new is how they are used for a purpose today within a consumerist society, and that purpose is a purpose of profiting large companies, but also a purpose of control. Those technologies were not designed initially as means of controls. Today, they are used in ways that are questionable. And you are absolutely correct. The real threats are absolutely not in those representations of doomsday and mean machines eliminating humans from the planet. The enemy is not the machine itself.
And I just wanted to touch something that Ron said as well, is about what AI is not. And in the education system, surprisingly, that's where we have to start. Is by when we talk about what AI is we have to start by talking about what it isn't, to debunk these myths. That's typically the first step. And we have something really unique happening in education, where right now, for example, if you want to do the program that I was talking about, you might be 22 years old and have just finished an undergraduate degree coming in, or you might have 3 decades of experience in the workplace already and be coming back. So we find people at very different parts of their career are coming to learn the same thing at the same time. And so that's pretty new, because it's a big unifier. That being said, the level of knowledge is going to be very different. So I think it's really important to talk about what AI isn't as a starting point, and even like to examine the concept, because a lot of what people know is movies, Tony Stark, all these types of things. But like asking some basic questions I find really helpful in starting those conversations. Like, well, what is intelligence? And so I mentioned like a background in psychology. That's something that we have trouble understanding as it is how does human consciousness and streaming consciousness work? So what does it mean to create artificial intelligence? And then we have all of these ideas of like generalized intelligence, or, the robotic uprising type of thing. And the more, on my journey of learning more and more about AI, you started to, even though you hear Elon Musk and Bill Gates talk about it, they're very macro level long-term thinkers. And I think they're talking about it as one day an eventuality, but no expert I've ever heard in the field has said, we know how that would happen. AI is currently very narrow in its uses and applications. Something like a general intelligence is very far away. So I think the starting point of the conversation and the education is debunking, figuring out what AI isn't before we start to learn what it actually is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, some great points, guys. Okay, so we have 4 minutes left, but I'm loving the conversation. I think our audience is as well. So we will throw one last question to go over. And what we have is, how do you think society can avoid a situation where the pursuit of making the biggest and best AI algorithm to dominate market share leads to irreversible climate impact? So kind of connected to our other question. Did anyone want to take this one away?
I mean, I guess I think the premise is doubtful that AI algorithms are going to be a material part of the climate change challenge. I think like every aspect of our society, we talked about before, we have to think about the impact, because it's all the things we're doing added up that are causing climate change. And if we're going to reverse it, we're going to have to stop emitting greenhouse gases. But even with I guess I don't believe that the continued trend of super exponential growth of resources being poured into AI algorithms is sustainable long term. I don't imagine we're going to see trillion-dollar investments in AI hardware later this decade, which would be the projection of current trends, right? Which would drive meaningful climate impact. So I think it's not just climate impact, though, that we should be worried about in terms of the AI arms race, and it's all of the negative impacts on our society, whether it be bias or polarization, addiction, misinformation, right? Filter bubbles. In all of these areas, as we've talked about, right, we do really need policy approaches. One thing I really like is Dr. Gillian Hadfield, who leads the Schwartz-Reisman Institute's idea of introducing innovation in regulatory technology, right? So having a way that you can have private companies make sure that other private companies are actually following good practices and ethical approaches, right? Rather than relying on the government to try to chase and write regulation when private actors are moving so fast.
Yeah, and I think what you said is like, this is not just a climate change issue. This is an issue of how AI is used. And we didn't get into it too much, but I think this is where the idea of explainability and interpretability come in. If there's more interpretable models, then we're understanding how they work and what they do and how they're making decisions. That's really important, because then you don't end up with this algorithm that you're just sort of like, oh, it told us to do this, and now, it's just we're just following it blindly. And so I think having conversations like what we're having today, having interpretable and explainable AI will help prevent this sort of situation from happening.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much, guys, for your incredible insights. Thank you so much for joining our panel, Rod, Valerie, and Rishi. It has been such a pleasure to listen to your discussion. I hope this has inspired some of you guys in the audience to, change your perspective, to put things into context, and have your own discussions on ethics and the concerns in AI, as we're developing the undergraduate landscape in AI. So thanks so much for joining our panel today, our Ethics in AI panel. I hope you continue on with the conference. We're heading, I believe, into a student or an executive industry showcase. So thanks so much, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.